Years ago, there was a pilot named David Cole who entered flight school with nothing but a dream and an old photograph of his grandfather, who had flown in another war. He was quiet, focused, and always the last one to leave the hangar when others laughed and celebrated their quick progress. David studied manuals. Until midnight, he was not fast on the controls like some others. His maneuvers were deliberate, measured, and often criticized by instructors who valued speed over precision. Called him hesitant. They whispered in break rooms that he might never make it into real missions, and one instructor went so far as to call him dead weight. David heard every word, but never answered back. He simply worked harder. He spent countless nights in the simulator running scenarios that others considered unnecessary, practicing emergency landings, power failures, and combat evasions. While classmates joked about him, he quietly adjusted settings and studied aerodynamic principles. Knew that one day such attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death, yet the perception stuck the slow, methodical pilot. The one you could not rely on in combat because he would freeze under pressure. David graduated, but without distinction. He was assigned to transport duties far from the front line. His call sign rarely heard in critical operations, and though disappointed, he did not complain. He flew supply runs. He evacuated minor casualties. He ferried officers from one post to another, and every time he landed safely, he quietly logged the flight data and returned to his quarters. Alonius passed like this, and the label clung to him still, despite a perfect safety record. Despite having 0 aircraft losses, his peers still viewed him as average, sometimes even a burden, the kind of pilot you tolerated but did not admire. Then one day, everything changed. A conflict erupted near a remote forward operating base, and all available pilots were called to missions. Except one, David Cole, who was still at base waiting for orders. His name appeared on standby lists, rarely activated, and he sat reading maintenance reports when the call came over the radio. A frantic voice reporting that a Black Hawk carrying 47 Marines had taken enemy fire and crashed behind hostile lines. Coordinates flashed on the screen. It was deep inside contested territory, and no pilots were available. All were out on assignments or grounded for repairs. David stood from his chair, heart pounding, his crew chief looking at him with surprise because everyone expected someone else to go. Yet David did not hesitate. He walked straight to his helicopter and signaled to prepare for immediate launch. His small crew followed, because they trusted his judgment more than the opinions of others. Within minutes, Reuters roared and dust filled the air as the helicopter lifted off, and David set his course toward the crash site with a calmness no one expected from someone once called dead weight. The urgency of the mission weighed heavily on David as he pushed the helicopter toward maximum speed. The sound of the rotors beating through the thin, hot air like a hammer on steel. His crew checked weapons and systems, while David reviewed every possible approach to the crash site in his head. The radio continued to relay desperate transmissions. Enemy forces were closing in. The Marines at the downed Black Hawk were fighting to hold their position, but ammunition was running low and injuries were mounting. David's hands were steady on the controls, his eyes scanning the horizon for threats. Years of being overlooked had never dulled his sense of responsibility. He knew that even if no one else believed in him, he had to believe in himself. This mission was not about proving critics wrong, it was about saving lives. Yet somewhere deep in his mind, the memory of being called dead weight gave him an added edge. He would not fail, not today. The terrain ahead was hostile. Jagged ridges rising like teeth from the earth, and every peak could conceal an enemy. David adjusted altitude, flying low to stay below radar as best as possible, but it increased the danger of ground fire. One of his crew warned of heat signatures indicating possible man-portable surface-to-air missiles. David acknowledged, calmly adjusting speed and vector. To reduce exposure, his voice carried no tremor, and the crew drew strength from his focus. Minutes felt like hours as they crossed into contested airspace. The radio crackled again, this time a strained Marine voice confirming they were still alive but surrounded, pinned down with wounded who could not move under fire. David calculated landing zones on the fly. None were ideal. The area was tight and covered by hostile guns, yet hesitation meant death. He made a plan, choosing a clearing less than 200 meters from the crash site, exposed but reachable. If he could hold a hover under fire long enough for extraction, enemy gunfire erupted before they even reached visual contact tracers cutting through the sky. One round struck near the cockpit, rattling the frame, but David did not flinch. He announced overcomes initiating descent, telling his crew to be ready for rapid loading. No second chance, no time for doubt. His training, the very precision people mocked, now became his greatest asset. Every control, input, exact, every move. Calculated, his methodical approach, keeping the helicopter stable, while rounds thudded against armor plating as the helicopter touched the edge of the clearing. Marines broke cover, running and dragging the wounded David. Maintained hover with surgical precision, his crew leaning out, firing suppressive bursts while shouting at Marines to move. Faster, the rotor wash kicked up dirt and smoke, limiting visibility, but David held position, muscles tight but controlled it. It was not flashy flying, but it was steady, and steady was what kept them alive as more Marines piled aboard under relentless gunfire, the weight increasing by the second. David prepared for the next step, knowing the real challenge was still ahead, getting everyone out alive. David kept his focus locked on the instruments and horizon, his hands firm but controlled on the cyclic and collective, every vibration of the helicopter translating through his body like an extension of himself. Enemy gunfire clattered against the airframe, sparking as rounds struck the armored plates, yet he held position. The Marines rushed in, carrying the wounded, their boots thudding on the metal floor as they shouted over the roar of the engines. One crew member leaned out, counting heads and yelling the tally, while firing short controlled bursts to push back enemy fighters closing in on the perimeter. The crash site itself was a scene of devastation. The Black Hawk that had gone down smoldered in flames with black smoke rising high into the sky, serving as a beacon to every hostile within miles. David registered it with one glance, then returned his focus to flying. The landing zone was already compromised, and the longer they stayed, the higher the risk. He told his crew to hurry and began calculating an immediate escape path that avoided the heaviest enemy fire. The Marines were exhausted, faces streaked with dirt and sweat, and some were bleeding heavily. One shouted that more were still behind the wreck, using the fragments of fuselage as cover. They would not leave without them. David made the choice to hold, despite warnings flashing on his threat detection system, a missile-locked tone sounding briefly before vanishing as he dipped lower to break the targeting angle. His calm voice over the intercom told everyone to keep moving. The same voice once doubted, now the anchor in a sea of chaos. When the last cluster of Marines broke from cover, dragging a badly injured soldier, David's crew chief signaled clear. The helicopter shuddered as it took the full weight of its human cargo far beyond standard troop load. David compensated, instantly adjusting the pitch and power while keeping altitude. Dangerously low enemy fire intensified, hitting closer than before. One round shattered a side window, sending shards of glass into the cabin, but no one stopped moving. They slammed the door shut and gave David the thumbs up. He pulled collective hard, the helicopter surging upward under strain. Alarms chimed from the engine as it strained near maximum output. David ignored the noise, relying on instinct and experience to nurse every ounce of power he could muster. The helicopter lumbered upward sluggish under the increased weight, but he coaxed it into a climb, banking sharply to the left to avoid the heaviest fire zone below. The sudden turn pressed everyone sideways, but it pulled them clear of an ambush attempt, where enemy fighters had tried to box them in from two angles. Bullets continued to chase them through the air, bright streaks against the sky. David kept weaving, adjusting altitude, and heading constantly, his slow, deliberate style now showing its true value. He never overcorrected, he never panicked. Instead, he charted a winding escape path that gave them just enough speed and cover to break contact. As the distance grew and enemy fire lessened, a wave of relief swept through the cabin. Yet David knew the hardest part was still ahead, the journey back to base with engines, strained weight, exceeding limits, and wounded needing urgent medical care. There was no room for error now. The helicopter trembled under the strain as David pushed it forward, engines howling from the weight of 47 Marines packed into every available space, some standing, some crouched over the wounded while gripping whatever they could to maintain balance. The cabin smelled of smoke, sweat, and blood, but no one complained. They all knew how close they had come to dying at the crash site. David kept his eyes scanning the horizon, his mind calculating fuel consumption and remaining power while also watching for new threats. Enemy units were mobile and quick to adapt, and he expected pursuit. His crew monitored sensors and scanned visually for incoming fire. One called out possible movement near a ridgeline, but David had already anticipated The risk shifting altitude and banking to create a moving target that would be harder to track, he had always been deliberate in training. Criticized for overthinking, yet now that same trait gave him control of a situation others might have mishandled. He was patient, precise, making small, controlled corrections. Instead of wild moves that could destabilize the helicopter under such extreme weight, a sudden flash on the radar indicated a heat signature. David recognized immediately what it meant. A potential missile lock. He dropped altitude, sharply hugging the terrain, so close the rotor wash kicked up dirt and loose vegetation. Marines held on tight, some gritting their teeth in fear, as the helicopter skimmed just above treetop level. David called out to prepare for evasive action, his calm, steady tone somehow keeping panic from spreading. He had trained for worst-case scenarios, and now it was saving their lives behind. Them enemy vehicles moved fast, attempting to cut off escape routes. David's crew fired suppressive bursts from mounted weapons, but ammunition was limited. They needed speed and stealth, not prolonged engagement. David shifted course again, zigzagging through a valley to break line of sight before pulling up suddenly into a steep climb, forcing gravity to pin everyone momentarily to the floor, then leveling off just as quickly. The maneuver burned precious fuel, but it reduced their exposure and bought them a few critical moments. One Marine shouted that a wounded man had stopped breathing. Another started chest compressions right there in the cabin. David heard it through the intercom, but never turned to look. His job was to get them out alive, and his mind stayed on flight instruments and threats ahead. Was flying low enough now that any mistake could be fatal, but every adjustment was exact. His years of practicing emergencies in litters, now proving their worth. Minutes stretched like hours, until finally the radio crackled with the voice of friendly command, confirming airspace near the forward base was clear. David exhaled slowly, but did not ease off. Yet they were not safe until they landed. The helicopter engines strained louder than ever, and warning lights flickered, showing heat levels approaching red line. He whispered to himself to hold together just a little longer, and promised the machine he would take care of it once they were home. His crew glanced at him, knowing every second of steady hands on the controls was keeping 47 Marines alive. The forward operating base appeared on the horizon, a faint collection of lights and structures, surrounded by a high perimeter wall and defensive positions, but for David it felt like a beacon of survival. Yet the mission was not over. He still had to land a heavily overloaded helicopter with engines running hot and wounded filling the cabin. Any mistake now could undo everything. His hands gripped the controls firmly, but without tension, his breathing, even as he adjusted pitch and power to stabilize descent. Inside the cabin, the Marines held tightly to one another, some keeping pressure on wounds, others silently staring at the floor, their adrenaline starting to fade, replaced by exhaustion. One Marine shouted toward the cockpit, asking if they were almost safe. David simply nodded, though no one could see his face. His calm voice over the intercom confirming approach and instructing everyone to brace for a heavy landing. His crew chief repeated the warning while double-checking the door and securing loose equipment. As they neared the base, a call came through from command, informing them that hostile forces were still in pursuit with a chance of long-range fire attempting to hit them before landing. David responded by dipping lower, using nearby terrain as partial cover while aligning with the runway. His deliberate flying style, once mocked as slow and overly cautious, now became their best defense. He took no unnecessary risks, but made every movement purposeful, conserving what little performance the stressed engines still had. The helicopter jolted as a crosswind caught them briefly. David adjusted instantly, using counter-torque and minor pitch changes to stabilize the craft. His mind calm, despite alarms still flashing from overheating components, fuel levels lower than desired, and the sheer weight of extra passengers behind him. One of the crew called out airspeed and clearance. David confirmed, then announced final descent. Everyone braced as the helicopter dropped. Lower rotor wash swirling dust into a storm below the base. Security teams, already positioned to receive them. Landing zone erupted in activity. Medics rushing toward the helicopter as soon as wheels touched dirt. David executed a controlled, hard landing, skids hitting the ground heavier than usual, but holding firm. The frame groaned, yet did not fail. He cut power gradually, even as Marines began unloading, the wounded shouts filling the air for stretchers and medical support. Others jumped down, running for defensive positions, still unsure if enemy pursuit might reach the base. David sat for a moment, hands still on the controls, as though glued in place, adrenaline draining slowly from his system when the cabin cleared. His crew chief looked at him, shaking his head with a half-smile, saying quietly that he had never doubted him, though both men knew many others had. David gave a small nod and finally removed his helmet, stepping out into the chaotic scene around him. 47 Marines saved from certain death standing on safe ground because he refused to hesitate. He looked up at the battered helicopter smoke curling from the exhaust and panels, peppered with bullet holes, whispering thanks to the machine that carried them home. The moment David stepped off the helicopter, he was met with medics rushing past, carrying stretchers, shouts echoing as wounded. Marines were triaged near the landing zone. The chaos of emergency care surrounded him, yet through it all David stood, silently watching as each Marine he had pulled from danger was handed over to safety. One officer approached quickly, saluting before asking for a full account of what happened. But David shook his head briefly, pointing to the wounded. His mind, they came first. The story could wait, lives could not. His crew stood nearby, some leaning against the battered helicopter, breathing heavily and exchanging looks of disbelief at what they had just survived. The aircraft itself bore scars of combat, multiple bullet holes across the fuselage, shattered glass on one side, and heat signatures still rising from the overworked engines. Yet it had done its job, carrying more weight than it was designed for. Flying through hostile fire and still landing intact, one mechanic walked up, eyes wide, asking how it even stayed airborne under such strain. David simply replied that it never quit, so neither did he inside. The medical tent doctors worked frantically to stabilize the injured one. Marine, who had been unresponsive during the flight, regained a pulse thanks to immediate intervention. Others suffered burns, fractures, and shrapnel wounds, but none were beyond help because they had made it back in time. David watched from outside. Not wanting to crowd the area, yet ready to step in if asked, he saw faces of gratitude mixed with exhaustion. Marines who had believed they would die now alive because one pilot refused to wait for backups. Soon after the commanding officer arrived, calling David aside to a quieter area away from the noise, the officer looked at him for a long moment before speaking, saying he had heard the rumors years ago about David being too cautious to slow labeled dead weight by peers, yet what he saw today was something different, something rare. He told David that leadership is not measured by speed or flash, but by results, and today the result was 47 Marines saved against impossible odds, David said, little simply, nodding and crediting his crew and the aircraft for their survival. Word of the rescue spread through the base faster than any official report. Marines who had never spoken to David before lined up to shake his hand, some clasping his shoulder, thanking him quietly, others saluting despite him being only a warrant officer. Not expecting such attention, he felt awkward, but accepted it, knowing the gratitude was genuine. His crew also received recognition, and for the first time many realized that the pilot once dismissed as dead weight had just completed one of the most daring extractions in recent memory. As night fell, David walked back to the helicopter, now quiet and cooling its scars, visible in the floodlights. He placed a hand on its side, whispering thanks, then sat alone on a nearby crate, reflecting on how close they all came to disaster and how icily it could have gone the other way. He thought about the years of doubt, and how in one day everything had changed, not because he sought glory, but because he stayed true to what he believed. Steady, deliberate, precise flying could save lives, and tonight it had proven true. The base was quiet the following morning, except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional call over the loudspeaker. David sat outside the hangar with a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring at the helicopter that had carried them all through. Chaos mechanics were already at work, replacing damaged panels and checking structural integrity, but several paused. When they saw him, one mechanic gave a small nod of respect, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had been done the day before. David simply returned the nod. Still not entirely used to being the center of attention, the Marines he had rescued came by in groups. Throughout the morning, some walking with bandages, others on crutches, all determined to thank him one after another. They told him how they thought they were done, for how they had said silent goodbyes in their minds before hearing his rotor blades. Approaching through smoke and gunfire, a few became emotional, gripping his hand firmly and promising to never forget. What he had done, David listened quietly, feeling a sense of weight he had not experienced before. He had saved lives before on smaller missions, but never at this scale, never when the odds were stacked so high. Later that day, the commanding officer gathered the entire base personnel for an impromptu address. Word of the mission had already reached higher headquarters and news outlets were requesting interviews, but the officer wanted to speak directly to the people who had witnessed it firsthand. He called David forward, introducing him not as the quiet pilot who stuck to routine flights, but as the man who flew straight into hostile fire. Alone and brought back 47 Marines without a single loss, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers, many chanting his name, something David never expected in his career. When the noise settled, the officer spoke about how sometimes the ones who are underestimated are the ones who rise when it matters most. He mentioned how David had been called dead weight early in his training, yet on that day he proved every critic wrong by staying calm when chaos reigned and by refusing to leave even a single Marine behind. David felt a flush of humility and pride as he looked at his crew standing nearby. They too received recognition, because without them the mission would not have been possible. They had trusted him completely, and he had trusted them in return. After the ceremony, David returned to the hangar to inspect the helicopter personally, running his hand along the patched armor and checking the rotor blades. Though it would be grounded for days, he felt a sense of gratitude toward the machine that had carried them safely. He thought about the moment he had first been told he would never make it as a combat pilot, and how those words had stayed with him for years. Now those same words felt distant, irrelevant, replaced by a simple truth: he had done his job when it mattered most, and lives were saved because of it. That night, he sat alone on a bench watching the stars, thinking not of the applause or attention, but of the look on the Marines' faces when they realized they were going home alive. He realized that was the only recognition that truly mattered. Days passed, and the story of the rescue spread beyond the forward base. It moved through every channel in the command structure, until even national outlets began reporting it. Headlines praising a pilot who once was dismissed as dead weight, but had saved 47 Marines in one mission. Requests for interviews flooded in, and military leadership announced that David and his crew would receive commendations. Yet David himself avoided the spotlight, preferring to spend his time maintaining readiness, flying routine missions, and checking on the Marines he had saved. He was humble about what happened, telling anyone who asked that he only did what any pilot would do. The Marines, however, would not let the story fade. They visited him daily, leaving small tokens like unit patches, signed photos, and handwritten notes, thanking him for giving them another chance at life. One Marine, who had been critically injured, stood on his own 2 feet just a week later, walking into the hangar to shake David's hand, tears streaming as he spoke about how he would see his family again, because David never hesitated in that moment. David realized the depth of what had been accomplished, not just a rescue, but a ripple effect, touching families and futures beyond that. Battlefield Day formal ceremony followed, where high-ranking officials attended, presenting David and his crew with medals for valor. The crowd stood silent as the citation was read, detailing the hostile environment, the overwhelming odds, and the precision under fire that made the mission possible. When David stepped forward to receive the medal, he thought about the long nights in flight school, the whispers of doubt, the instructors who said he lacked instinct and was too slow. He thought about how those words nearly made him quit. Yet in that moment, he understood that perseverance had always been his strength. He did not need to be the fastest or flashiest. He needed only to be steady, focused, and willing to act when others hesitated. After the ceremony, David returned to his quarters, sitting quietly away from the noise outside. He reflected on how easily things could have gone wrong, how any small mistake could have meant disaster, but instead, every decision had aligned with his training, every action deliberate and calm. The very traits once ridiculed had saved lives and turned him into someone others now trusted implicitly. It was a lesson he carried with him, a reminder that what others see as weakness can become strength in the right circumstances. In the weeks that followed, David continued flying missions, though now with a reputation that preceded him. He noticed how young pilots began seeking his advice, how commanders requested his input on risky operations, and how Marines saluted him with genuine respect. No one called him dead weight anymore. They called him the pilot who would never leave anyone behind. David accepted it quietly, choosing to remain the same humble, steady man he had always been, because, in his mind, it was never about recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done and proving through action that he was worthy of the wings he wore.